Okay, so good morning everyone. Thank you all for being here today and on the third and final day of the academic conference hosted by the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Madras. So the conference, as you know, is centered on the theme of migration, and we greatly appreciate this enthusiasm on a Sunday morning. I know that's difficult. So in a few minutes, Professor Priya Kumar will inaugurate the English studies session of the conference by delivering the keynote lecture titled Infiltrators in Our Midst, the Construction of Legality, Illegality and Documentary Citizenship. So a little bit about Dr. Priya Kumar. She has been an associate professor with the English Department, College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, University of Iowa since 2001 and is currently a part of the faculty at the Department of English, University of Delhi. Her book, Limiting Secularism, The Ethics of Coexistence in Indian Literature and Film, discusses secularism and tolerance in Indian life and culture, which is a pressing issue of great importance in the current scenario. At present, she is occupied with a book project on cross-border displacement and the narratives of migration involved in partitions as part of her Fulbright project titled Other Exiles, Literature of Displacement and Exile, focusing on cross-border movements that followed the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947 and 1971 respectively. So on behalf of the entire conference team as well as the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, we would like to extend a warm welcome to you, ma'am.
So I was beginning with my thanks and I just wanted to say thanks to the entire organizing committee for inviting me to give this talk, and particularly to Yashaswini, Rukma and Shilpa, and special thanks to Shilpa for being so amazingly helpful yesterday because I wasn't feeling very well. So please forgive me if I need to stop in the middle and drink water and have lozenges or something. This paper is part of a larger project that looks at cross-border migrations between India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, which emerged in the wake of the partitions of India and Pakistan in 1947 and in 1971, and which have continued steadily across the eastern border of India for a variety of reasons. Migration and diaspora, as you all know it, have become major preoccupations of many South Asian writers in English, especially those writers who live and work in the West, such as Salman Rushdie, Jhumpa Lahiri, Monica Ali, Hanif Qureshi and others. Scholars on diaspora often tend to take diasporic fictions emerging from Anglo-America as representative of the experience of South Asian displacements everywhere. And it was really gratifying to look through your schedule right now and see how there are presentations about Malayalis in the Gulf, or people in Madagascar, or the experience of Biharis in the whole phenomenon of indentured labor. So that's sort of what I'm trying to argue over here, that we really need to question some of the current paradigms of diaspora and diasporic literature as they have been institutionalized within the Anglo-American Academy, because they tend to focus more on South Asian diasporic writers who are living and working out of the West. So indeed, I argue that Anglo-American post-colonial studies have participated in privileging the newer diasporas of advanced capital to Europe and North America at the expense of the older diaspora, that is the 19th century movement of South Asians to places such as Trinidad, Fiji, Guyana, Malaysia and Africa as indentured labor, as well as at the cost of ignoring cross-border population movements within the subcontinent. And that's where I situate my project, that I don't think enough work has been done on population movements and migrations, and I'm particularly talking about cross-border migrations within the South Asian region or to the South Asian region. So my book project thus seeks to challenge conventional scholarship on post-colonial diasporas, where particular diasporic roots and histories have become definitive of the experience of migration, thus overshadowing other histories of dispersal. In my talk today, I consider the fraught issue of illegal or clandestine migrations from East Pakistan, Bangladesh to India through an examination of two Indian language fictional narratives, Prafulla Roy's Bengali story Stateless and N.S. Madhavan's Malayalam story Mumbai, and both of them were published around 1996-1997. The three questions I seek to address are: when and how did migrations from that region come to be viewed as illegal migrations and infiltration rather than as a form of homecoming? When did the Indian state move from an official narrative of hospitality, which I'll go on to explain, to one of overt hostility? By making visible the Indian state's historical and contingent construction of the category of the illegal migrant, and therefore I always use the term illegal migrant within quotes, I argue that the Indian citizen and the illegal Bangladeshi are both deeply unstable categories liable to interpretation, contestation, and mutual slippages. The two stories I examined reveal the state's construction of the illegal migrant, its hostile responses to what it views as the influx of clandestine migrants from East Pakistan, Bangladesh, the strategies undertaken by migrants to resist such measures, paradoxically with the aid of certain sections of the state, and the ways in which Bengali-speaking Muslims in particular are scapegoated by official agencies and courts of law. Significantly, both short fictions turn around the importance of documents or the lack of documents for authenticating citizenship and the right to settle in India. I call them my ration or ration card fictions, and you'll see why. The stories center around a particular Indian document that until recently served as a de facto national identity card, the ration card. I'll often use ration card because that's how it is used in most of North India. It is one of the most easily acquired forms of documentation in India and can be easily forged or acquired through fraudulent means. Roy and Madhavan's stories suggest that it is documents or the lack thereof that determine whether an individual can stay and settle in India irrespective of whether he or she is an illegal migrant or not, according to the status definition, which itself is open to interpretation, as you'll go on to see. The stories also underline how the lack of citizenship authenticating papers can constitute one as a non-person in the eyes of the state. Above all, the stories enable us to imagine the precarious existence of the sans-papiers, literally those without paper, especially those who've been constituted as illegal migrants and infiltrators in our midst. Now, I'll begin by talking about the shift's narrative from homecoming to illegality. The pangs of state formation in 1947 resulted in immense outmigration from Pakistan to India and from India to Pakistan in both directions. In the early years, both India and Pakistan welcomed the partition refugees and did their best to accommodate the citizenship claims of millions of displaced people. Partition refugees were constituted as would-be citizens who were joining the nation to which they belong, Hindus and Sikhs as Indians and Muslims as Pakistanis. Their journey across the border and their arrival in Pakistan or India were constituted as a form of homecoming. Although the initial narrative, hospitable narrative of homecoming never entirely faded, migrants increasingly encountered hostility, especially in borderland areas like Assam and Tripura in India and Sindh in Pakistan. Thus, there were many migrant groups and individual subjects who were never really welcomed or incorporated into the new national orders of India and Pakistan, despite the official homecoming narrative of the Indian state towards Hindu and Sikh refugees and of the Pakistani state towards Muhajirs. And as you all probably know, the term Muhajir is used specifically today to talk about Urdu-speaking migrants from India's Muslim minority provinces to the urban areas of Sindh. But initially it was used to talk about all migrants from India, irrespective of what language they spoke and where in India they had migrated from. But in this paper, I look at the specific instance of migrations across the eastern border from East Pakistan, Bangladesh to India. Now, while population exchange in the Punjab was sudden, massive, and very dramatic, it was almost complete by 1947 and 1948, the movement of people in Bengal was less dramatic and happened in waves over a much longer period of time. Although earlier migrants from East Pakistan were accommodated in Calcutta and its environs, later migrants found it difficult to claim a place in the state despite their shared Bengali Hindu identity, which had to do with differences in the class and caste composition of the two groups. The government of West Bengal viewed these later arrivals as a joint burden to be shared with the central government and the neighboring states. Accordingly, the poorest of these refugees were forced to move to various inhospitable and infertile areas in central India, such as Danda, Karania and Mana in the late 50s and throughout the 60s, under pressure from the provincial West Bengal government. And many of you may have read Amitav Ghosh's The Hungry Tide, and this is sort of fictionalized this episode, the Morij Jhapi episode, is fictionalized in that novel. Now, if the massive migrations that took place in the aftermath of the 1946 riots in Bihar and partition in 47 constituted the first staggered phase of mass migration, then the refugee narrative reached its second crucial phase in 1971 during the liberation war of Bangladesh and the second partition of the subcontinent. Most of the time we don't even refer to 71 as a partition, but in effect it was the second or even the third partition, which we can go on to talk about. Millions of refugees fled from the atrocities of the Pakistani army into India. By the end of the war, it is said about 10 million refugees had crossed the border into India, although this figure is impossible to verify. But what happened to these refugees after the war? While most East Pakistani Bangladeshi refugees returned to their homes after the end of the war, a considerable number, both Hindus and Muslims, stayed on in India. Subsequently, these ethnic networks facilitated large flows of Bangladeshis into the northeast of India, particularly the state of Assam. As Ranveer Samadar points out, without 1971 and more generally without the period of 71 to 75, migration in the 1980s were inconceivable. The migration and refugee trails have led deep into both the countries. Migration into Bangladesh slowed down considerably after 71. However, cross-border movements from Bangladesh into India have continued steadily for a variety of complex reasons, including outbreaks of violence, political persecution of religious and linguistic minorities, and more often than not, desperate hunger and poverty. Most of these more recent movements of people are made in defiance of state-decreed borders and statist conceptions of legality and illegality. Many Bangladeshi peasants clandestinely migrate to India from what are known as Monga-prone areas. Basically, Monga is a seasonal famine which impels many peasants to sort of migrate to areas where they feel they have a chance of making a livelihood, and they do it as a survival strategy and render post-partition boundaries irrelevant. But when did the state's homecoming narrative metamorphose into the language of illegality? That's the main question I seek to historicize in this section. And the key date over here is 1971 and 72. The Indira Mujib Pact of 1972 made 1971 the official cutoff year for establishing cross-border migrations across the eastern border as illegal. The pact held that Bangladesh would not be held responsible for persons who had migrated to India before the birth of the new republic prior to March 25, 1971. So by establishing post-March 1971 migrations to India as illegal, the pact marked an explicit shift away from the homecoming narrative of the partition era. At the same time, it also served paradoxically as a way of accommodating the many thousands of migrants who were already in India from that region. And this is especially pertinent if we keep in mind that Assamese politicians had wanted to establish 1951 as the cutoff date for demarcating illegality. And this continues to be a sore matter of dispute between local level politicians, particularly in Assam and at the sort of national level, whether we should take 1971 as the cutoff date, should we take 1951. So even there is, what I'm trying to suggest is there's disagreement between different levels of the state about what should be the cutoff date for establishing someone as legal or illegal, right? In effect, the state had, by this pact, the state had granted legality to migration in a certain period, that is pre-1971, through an international agreement which in the end became a catalyst for merging the illegal into the legal to gain legitimacy. And that's a quote from Samadar. Indeed, the Indian state continued to accommodate East Bengali migrants for an extended period, at least until the mid-70s, so much after the 71 period. So it tried to accommodate them, and how did it do so? By providing food subsidies and voting rights depending on where in India they had migrated to, despite the hostility they encountered in areas like Assam and Tripura. Migrants were accepted and absorbed into Indian society and given access to rights and benefits usually reserved for Indian citizens. The category of the illegal Bangladeshi migrant thus remains a fuzzy and blurred one, given the long durée and complex history of migrations from East Bengal, East Pakistan, Bangladesh into India. Thus, any attempt at marking off the Indian citizen, the proper recipient of rights, from the illegal Bangladeshi is doomed to contestations, slippages and ambiguities, despite the recent efforts of the Indian state to make citizenship laws more rigid. And I'd be happy to answer more specific questions after reading out my paper about this. But in the next section now, I'll focus on citizenship as legal status and the production, that is the state's production of the category of the illegal migrant. In order to understand the Indian state's production of illegality, I suggest that we need to understand first who is the subject of citizenship and who is eligible to be a citizen of India. Focusing on the aspect of citizenship as legal status conferred by the state, I examine who can or cannot be a citizen of India and how the boundaries of inclusion and exclusion have shifted over the years. Typically, legal citizenship is determined by one of two rival principles. The first is jus soli, which means citizenship by birth. The second being jus sanguinis, that is blood or descent-based citizenship. The choice of either principle determines how citizenship may be acquired and hence who can or cannot be a citizen, although the pure version of either principle is actually rare in practice. Now, Indian citizenship started on an inclusive jus soli note. That is, under the Citizenship Act of 1955, anyone born on the territory of India could be an Indian citizen, irrespective of the nationality of his or her parents. But it has moved in the direction of a more restrictive jus sanguinis model, reflecting the growth of exclusionary leanings in Indian society and politics since independence. Now, the tendency in scholarship on citizenship has been to view this movement as a linear model of regression. However, political theorist Mirza Jayal questions the standard narrative from virtuous jus soli to less virtuous jus sanguinis, with the moment of rupture occurring in the 1980s through the implementation of the Assam Accord and the First Amendment to the Citizenship Act in 1986. She shows how the tensions between these two rival conceptions of citizenship was present at the founding moment of the Republic, which was especially evident in the Constituent Assembly debates around Article 7 of the Constitution. And this is something I can talk about in more detail, but in the interest of time, I won't go into it right now. But basically, Article 6 dealt with the citizenship claims of those who had migrated to India from what became Pakistan before July 1948. That is to say, Hindus and Sikhs mainly who came from Pakistan to India. But Article 7 interestingly had to do with the citizenship claims of those who came to be known as returning Muslims. That is, Muslims who had migrated to Pakistan but had subsequently returned to India from across the western border. And now there is a lot of anxiety about these returning Muslims because their loyalty was seen as suspect and because of the anxieties surrounding evacuee property which had already been given to Hindu and Sikh refugees from Pakistan. So it was one of the most intensely contested articles in the Constituent Assembly. That is what Jayal points out. But despite these tensions between the principle of jus soli as a more inclusive model of national citizenship and jus sanguinis as a more exclusionary model, which were reflected in the Constituent Assembly debates, Mirza Jayal argues that jus soli remains the defining feature of Indian citizenship as laid out in the Indian Constitution. And here we have to differentiate between the Constitution and statutory law, citizenship law. So the move from jus soli to a more exclusionary jus sanguinis has happened gradually with time and is reflected more visibly in statutory law, particularly in recent amendments to the Citizenship Act. Now, the most significant amendments to the Citizenship Act took place in 1986 and in 1992, and they were specifically made in response to increasing apprehensions and anxieties about in-migration from Bangladesh, particularly in the state of Assam, even though the anxieties about the presence of Sri Lankan Tamils in Tamil Nadu have also played a role. The presence of large number of Bengalis in Assam sparked off tremendous anti-Bengali agitation and violence in the early 1980s in Assam, spearheaded by a powerful nativist student movement which eventually led to the signing of the Assam Accord in 1985. Now, according to the Assam Accord, all those who had migrated before 1966 from East Pakistan were to be treated as Indian citizens. So, rather than 71, 66 becomes an interesting date for the Assam Accord. So anyone before 66 could be treated as an Indian citizen, while those who had migrated between 66 and 71 could stay in India so long as they registered as foreigners and their names were deleted from the electoral roll. This had to do with Assamese concerns about inflated electoral rolls for Assam because of the enfranchisement of many migrants from what is now Bangladesh, because the state itself had in fact given them voter ID cards, etc., etc. So, and of course those who migrated after 71 were simply to be treated as illegal migrants. The centerpiece of the Assam Accord was a new section of the Constitution 6A specifically meant to exclude Bangladeshi migrants from Indian citizenship. Accordingly, the citizenship law was amended in 1986, 1992 and once again in 2004. And we see how this law has become more and more regressive and exclusionary. Because like I said, initially anyone born in India could be or would be considered a citizen of India so long, and it didn't matter who your parents were or what their nationality was. But according to the amendment, the principle of jus soli would only apply to those born in India before 1986. Those born after 1986 could only claim citizenship if one of their parents was a citizen of India at the time of their birth. So even if you're born in India, you will not be considered, or you will only be considered a citizen if one of your parents was a citizen. The 2004 amendment to the Citizenship Act made these exclusions even more evident, modifying the provision of citizenship by birth to exclude from it such persons born in India as having one parent who is an illegal migrant at the time of their birth. So according to the most recent amendment, even if you're born in India, but if one of your parents is designated or categorized as an illegal migrant, you will not be considered a citizen of India. Thus, we see how the principle of jus soli gets diluted over the years as the Indian state laid out a series of exclusions that were meant specifically to prevent Bangladeshi migrants from claims to Indian citizenship. It is apparent that while seeking to define the subject of self of Indian citizenship, the Indian state was in fact implicitly producing the category of its other, the illegal migrant. That's my key argument over here about citizenship. Now I'll talk briefly about the term infiltration and its overlap with the concept of illegality and its differences as well. And then I'll go on to talk about the two short stories that are very illuminating. The terms illegal migrant and infiltrator are often used interchangeably, especially with reference to Bangladeshi migrants in India, particularly Muslims. And here the BJP has a very interesting discourse where it refers to Hindu migrants from Bangladesh as refugees and Muslim migrants as illegal migrants. It is important to keep in mind, however, that the term infiltration also has its own unique and specific history that predates, in fact, the status construction of illegality. The narrative of infiltration first emerged in the states of Assam and Tripura in the 1940s and 50s to withhold citizens' rights, specifically land rights to Bengali migrants from East Pakistan. In the 1960s, it surfaced in the official discourse of the Indian state in connection with identifying and expelling these migrants from Tripura and Assam. The term became widely prevalent once again during the nativist student movement in Assam in the early 1980s. Over the years, the narrative of infiltration has intensified into the language of demographic invasion by Bangladesh. The discovery that many of the more recent migrants from Bangladesh are Muslims, that is, job and dignity seekers in search of a better life, dovetailed with the emergence of the Hindu right in India in the 80s and 90s, which took up the narrative of infiltration and made it into a national issue. Indeed, Hindu nationalist forces have played a crucial role in bringing unauthorized migrants from Bangladesh to the center stage of national politics and making them the focal point of persistent debate and controversy. Hindu nationalist politicians have criminalized migrants from Bangladesh, constructing them as a health threat, a law and order problem, a burden on society, and a security threat to the Indian nation who must be driven out of the country. The public discourse of infiltration has been reinforced by systematic campaigns of eviction and deportation, particularly from 1992 onwards, that seek to identify and drive out illegal migrants from Bangladesh in India. The rationale underpinning such campaigns has been that, and this is a quote from Willem van Schendel, that the duty of any true Indian patriot was not to welcome immigrants as repatriates coming home, the earlier homecoming narrative, but to deport them as foreign agents out to destabilize, Islamicize, and ultimately annex entire regions of India to Bangladesh. Clearly, eviction and expulsion of suspected Bangladeshis is the very antithesis of the earlier statist narrative of hospitality towards Hindu and Sikh partition era migrants. So, and now I'll go on to talk about the two specific short stories that I want to consider and draw to your attention, which are very illuminating in this context. The first literary narrative I examined, Prafulla Roy's Stateless or Deshnei, it's a Bengali story, tells the story of an East Bengali migrant proletariat in Bombay who is constituted as an illegal migrant by petty functionaries of the state, despite the fact that he has been living in Bombay for 30 years. We are told he had migrated to India from East Pakistan when he was 5 years old. The story doesn't specify dates other than indicating that Asad had crossed the border sometime before the crucial year of 1971. Stateless opens on a scene of happy anticipation as Asad, his soon-to-be wife Johura, and her sister Zorina sit overlooking the Arabian Sea. Asad is looking forward to his upcoming marriage after many years working as a construction worker. His dream of settling down with someone finally seems to be coming true at the opening of the story, but the narrative arc of the story moves from the scene of hopeful anticipation to complete hopelessness and despair at the end, as Asad is deported and left adrift on the border with Bangladesh, a victim of the political discourse of infiltration. After his day out with his fiancée, when Asad returns to his home in the slum of Dharavi, he learns from his friend Rajibul that the police have been looking for him because they believe him to be an illegal migrant from what is now Bangladesh. Rajibul advises him to lay low for a few days and go to a locality called Ghatkopar, where there are other East Bengalis like him. Subsequently, Asad learns about the deportation drive being conducted by the police, which was targeting people from Pakistan and Bangladesh. He hears about how the police went to the home of his acquaintance Hamid, who had come to India at the time of the Bangladesh war in 71 and had asked to see his ration card. Because Hamid is able to produce this document, one of the acceptable documents of identification, they leave without a fuss. Asad and others like him are bewildered as to why, and I quote, after all this time the police should be seeking out people who had come from East Pakistan 30 and 40 years ago, end quote. Throughout, the story emphasizes Asad's sense of anxiety and insecurity. A pervasive sense of fear and dread runs through the story, leading up to the inevitable moment of eviction and deportation. There appears to be a brief respite when Asad returns to Dharavi after waiting it out for 10 to 12 days. Both he and Rajibul want to believe that the worst is over and Asad starts looking forward to his marriage again, but catastrophe strikes once again in the form of several pairs of booted feet who come knocking at his dwelling one evening and accuse him of being an illegal Bangladeshi migrant. When Rajibul tries to come to his aid and tells the police officer that Asad has been living in India for the past 30 years, they insist that he must have come recently and demand documentary proof like a ration card or a voter ID card. Asad, who had worked for years as a migrant proletariat in Mumbai and had barely managed to survive, thinks to himself that he had no permanent address, so how could he even procure a ration card? What is more, he had never thought that he would need such a document. Despite Rajibul and Asad's protests, the constables drag Asad to their jeep and take him to the police station. So Stateless illuminates how the category of the illegal Bangladeshi migrant is a fuzzy and blurred one and susceptible to slippages with marginal resident Indians who migrated before 1971 from East Pakistan like Asad, especially those who do not carry any form of documentation. Roy shows how Asad's Muslim and Bengali identity comes into play in the construction of his identity as an illegal migrant. When the sub-inspector first sees Asad, he asks him, "Are you Asadul Mia?" And when he gives the order to take Asad to the station, he says, "Takes this Asadul Mia away." It's almost as if he needs to confirm and reiterate Asad's Muslim identity by the repeated use of the term Mia to justify that he is indeed an outsider who must be evicted. As a Bengali-speaking Muslim living in the slums, Asad is de facto an illegal migrant for the increasingly exclusionary Indian state unless he can authenticate his claims by means of documentary proof. Pointing to the increasing dependence of modern states on documents to identify their members, Kamal Sadiq suggests that the documentation of individual identity is part of an infrastructure of citizenship that seeks to create a citizenship from above. Documentation is a means of controlling and monitoring the population for the purposes of domestic administration and crucially as well for differentiating citizens from foreigners. Kamal Sadiq traces how the systematic documentation of individuals first appeared in the 19th century in Western countries as a means of securing the state from foreigners. Since the Second World War, documents such as national censuses, national databases, identity cards and passports became crucial for embodying the individual identity of a citizen and for connecting the individual to the state. In newly independent post-colonial states like India that sought to emulate their European counterparts, the acquisition of paperwork by citizens became more and more important as states began to have meaning in the everyday life of their residents and expanded their functions through taxation and poverty alleviation programs. So to utilize public distribution systems, hospitals, dispensaries, schools, banks, utility services, one needed to show identification documents. And in the last section of my paper, I'll be talking briefly about Aadhaar and how this is relevant to what we are discussing here. As Sadiq argues, and I quote, documentation has become fused with individual identity to create a distinctive feature of modern developing states such that your document is your identity. If you don't have the relevant documents, you don't have an identity in effect that connects you to the state. Moreover, documents are crucial for the state's exercise of sovereignty over its territory and its population and to prevent unlawful entry by people from other nation states. Yet, and this is very crucial to Sadiq's argument as well, in countries like India and Pakistan, and he also talks about Malaysia, ironically it is the same documents which also provide the means for irregular migrants to circumvent and subvert citizenship from above, given the many cultural and physical similarities between newcomers and residents, the weakly institutionalized nature of citizenship in these countries, and the pervasive presence of what Sadiq calls networks of complicity and profit. When people migrate across national borders, the very documents that are meant to secure the sovereignty of the states can also enable the incorporation and settlement of migrants into a new polity. That is, if they get the documents, that will enable them to settle in their lands of arrival. This is the process that Sadiq terms documentary citizenship, which is the acquisition and possession of seemingly legal documents, that is either fake documents or genuine but fraudulently acquired documents by illegal migrants that prove juridical membership in a state, a process through which citizenship status can be ascribed to a non-citizen. So basically he is talking about the widespread phenomenon of so-called illegal migrants, and again I put that within quotes because the very category itself is so unstable, but illegal migrants acquiring documents such as the ration card or voter ID cards, etc. And either these are fake documents or they are genuine but fraudulently acquired, and it's a very, very widespread phenomenon. So while Sadiq's notion of documentary citizenship is very useful for theorizing how this widespread phenomenon is what he calls a back channel to many of the everyday benefits and rights associated with legal citizenship, including the crucial one of voting or political suffrage, it is also troubling because it takes the category of the illegal Bangladeshi migrant for granted. It does not acknowledge how the illegal Bangladeshi is a shifting and historically mutating category, given continuing disagreements between different levels of the Indian state about the cut-off date, and given the shifting boundaries of citizenship inclusion and exclusion, as I've tried to show. The question of who is eligible to be a legal citizen of India itself has shifted over the years, as I've been arguing. Moreover, Sadiq does not concede how the state itself sought to accommodate to different degrees many East Bengali migrants for a long time by providing them access to rights and entitlements usually reserved for citizens, such that the categorical difference between the citizen and resident was dissolved for a long time. So stateless does not make clear, I return to the story, stateless does not make clear whether Asad had migrated from East Pakistan before 1966 or after, which is the date set by the Assam Accord, but it is clear that he had crossed the border along with his parents before the crucial cut-off date of 1971. Hence, he is not an illegal migrant by the status definition. However, his nationalist credentials will always be suspect because of his belated entry into the nation's space and because he is Muslim. The story shows how the very definition of illegality gets transformed and translated in the discourses and practices of official state agencies and courts of law, and how the lack of documents can lead to eventual expulsion of vulnerable residents like Asad. Right? So indeed, Asad and the omniscient narrator of the story do not seek to provide a legalistic justification for his right to stay in India. Rather, they keep reiterating the moral argument about his length of stay. The fact that he had lived in India for 30 years and has known no other home. And I quote from the story, of course, whether he and Jahura hailed from Bihar or Bangladesh, Mumbai was indeed home to them now, as they had lived there for so many years and had set their roots deep in the city. They could not even think of leaving it for anywhere else. When the police officer abuses Asad, calling him a bastard illegal immigrant, and calls him to question his Indian identity, Asad pleads with him saying, I came to India when I was 5 years old. India is my home. Unlike the emblematic diasporic narratives about partition by writers such as Kurutilin Haider and Intizar Hussain, there is no nostalgia for the ancestral homeland here. All Asad would like to do is stay on in Mumbai, where he has been living for most of his life. Thus, when he is taken to the West Bengal border, Asad feels like he had left a familiar world and had landed on some unknown planet. When the Bangladeshi border officials interrogate Asad, he can't even recall the name of his ancestral village. What is more, the Bengali he speaks is infected with a mixture of Hindi, Urdu and Marathi, further reinforcing his distance from his East Bengali origins, leading one officer to tell Asad in an echo of his Indian counterpart, you don't belong to this country, get back to India. The story ends with the poignant image of Asad walking towards the Indian border, caught in the no man's land along with others like him, knowing that they would be sent back again. Denied the legal status of citizenship by both states, Asad is literally caught in the middle. The space of the no man's land as a liminal and potentially utopian space between nation states is a recurrent and emblematic trope in South Asian fiction and film, most famously deployed, as you know, in Saadat Hasan Manto's Urdu short story, Toba Tek Singh, in which the protagonist dies in the no man's land between India and Pakistan. It's also deployed in this film that many of you may be familiar with, Raj Kapoor's Hina, where Hina, the protagonist, dies on the no man's land between India and Pakistan. Roy's story ends with the narrator's meditation on Asad's liminal identity, which has effectively rendered him stateless and homeless. And I quote, Asad was born an East Pakistani, then for 30 years he was an Indian, during which time East Pakistan became Bangladesh. After all these years, it was determined that he was not an Indian, nor was he a Bangladeshi. He was stateless. Denied the legal status of citizenship by both states, Asad is literally caught in the middle and finds himself a refugee, according to Hannah Arendt's use of the term, someone with no state willing to recognize or guarantee his or her rights. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the second story that I'm discussing, which is N.S. Madhavan's story. The issue of possessing the right documents for verifying one's citizenship becomes crucial as well in the next story I examine, N.S. Madhavan's Mumbai. A Kafkaesque narrative, Mumbai tells the story of Aziz, a Muslim from Kerala who lives and works in Bombay. The story is set in the mid-90s in the immediate aftermath of the Maharashtra state elections when the Shiv Sena BJP combined came to power. Aziz is a sales engineer with no interest in politics or the elections other than how they impact the stock index. The story turns around its protagonist's inability to procure the necessary papers for validating his citizenship and his residence in India because he is a Muslim. Madhavan's story dramatizes how the Indian Muslim as stranger is always on the verge of being positioned as a foreigner and eventually as an enemy who must be expelled. And I can talk about these overlapping terms, stranger, foreigner and enemy later on. The crisis happens when Aziz's company wants to send him to Frankfurt for some work and he requires a passport to travel. His travel agent tells him that to be able to apply for the passport, he is going to need a ration card as proof of residence. This is before the time of Aadhaar, right? The story illuminates the complicated and in this case impossible process of acquiring a ration card for a minority religious subject because his or her nationalist credentials can come under suspicion at any point of time. At the supply office, Aziz encounters the deceptively innocent figure of Pramila Gokhale, who is in charge of issuing the ration cards. The story depicts 3 meetings between Aziz and Pramila Gokhale, and each meeting culminates in an increasingly besieged and fearful Aziz. At the first meeting, Pramila Gokhale asks him if he or his family have any property or tax receipts for their land, and when he answers in the negative, she tells him he must prove that he is Indian to be able to be eligible for a ration card. When an angry Aziz asks her what if she were asked to prove her Indianness, she reports, and I quote, "I will just tell them my name. That's all. My name is both my history and geography. Pramila Gokhale, Maharashtrian, Hindu, Chitpavan Brahmin. Do you understand?" In a characteristic manifestation of Hindu majoritarianism, Pramila Gokhale she asserts caste Hindus as the core or organic nationals of India, while the Muslim is constructed as a perpetual stranger because of the belated arrival of Islam in the nation space of India. In the second encounter between the two, Pramila Gokhale's North Indian majoritarianism is made evident when she denies the very existence of Aziz's village in Kerala. And forgive my North Indian majoritarianism if I am mispronouncing this, which the name of the village is Pang, and it's P-A-N-G, P-A-A-N-G-H. It is Pang. A name like that, no, it's not possible. There can't be a village with a name like that in India. In the third and final Kafkaesque encounter, she denies Aziz his very identity and by extension his legal status as an Indian. She begins by asking him whether he was present in India in 1970. And when he says, "I wasn't even born in 1970, she insists that he's an infiltrator from Bangladesh because he cannot validate his existence in India before the crucial cutoff year of 1971. So it doesn't matter if you were even present in the world or not. The atmosphere of the story grows increasingly nightmarish and surreal with each encounter between Pramila Gokhale and Aziz. This is heightened by Madhavan's views of the figure of the crowd outside Gokhale's office. In an otherwise realist narrative, the crowd serves as a surreal device for commenting on the absurdity of Aziz's situation. The crowd appears as a vague, amorphous and ambivalent figure in the text. It is never entirely clear whether they are sympathetic to crowd, laughing at him, or at the hopelessness of his situation. The first time Aziz encounters the crowd, they appear to be sympathetic to his plight. Thus, when he asks Pramila Gokhale how she would feel if she were asked to prove her nationalist credentials, he hears the sound of innumerable feet on the other side of the door. We are told that there was a crowd of faces at Pramila Gokhale's office window, and Aziz sees a wave of anger darken their faces momentarily. At this point, the reader feels that the crowd is aligned with Aziz. They could be supplicants like him who are waiting interminably for their ration card. The second time when Aziz meets Pramila and she asks Pang, what Pang, displaying her ethnocentrism, we are told that, and I quote, "an ominous rumble spread among the many feet visible on the other side of the door." In this instance, the crowd appears to be affiliated with Pramila given the use of the term ominous. And finally, in the third encounter, the crowd appears to be complicit with Pramila. When a despairing Aziz asks her whether he'll ever get his ration card, she smiles, and the people outside roar with laughter. The third encounter may be read as a typical instantiation of Freud's definition of a joke, which often relies on a triangulated relationship between the creator of the joke, the object of the joke, and the third, that is the witness who laughs. In this scene, the crowd can be read as standing in for the third, the witness who laughs with Pramila at Aziz. However, I would suggest that the crowd also serves as a device for generating black humor within the story. Drawing on Hegel's notion of objective humor and Freud's concept of gallows humor, André Breton coined the term black humor or humor noir, which he views as a sensibility, a superior revolt of the mind, a way of coping with the pointlessness of modern life. Black humor acknowledges that the painful realities it considers cannot be ameliorated or changed, but it uses laughter to comment upon and critique these realities. In Madhavan's story, the crowd is laughing at the absurdity and hopelessness of Aziz's situation in a typical manifestation of black humor, while implicitly critiquing the external circumstances that have brought him to this absurd place. Mumbai ends with the image of a besieged and vulnerable Aziz hiding under his bed like a stillborn child as two policemen stand guard outside his building. The story highlights his very real fear that he could be deported from India at any time now, now that an official of the Indian state has used her discretionary powers to construct him as a Bangladeshi infiltrator, even though he was born in India to Indian parents. So by any definition, he's not an illegal migrant despite all the slippages we've been talking about. If Roy's stateless shows how the illegal Bangladeshi is a fuzzy and uncertain category and open to interpretation, Mumbai brings to light how the category of the Indian citizen is also not stable, and slippages with the illegal Bangladeshi are routine and commonplace for those who share affinities of religion and or language with Bangladeshis, especially if they do not possess the relevant documents of identification. Aziz serves as an emblematic figure for all Indian Muslims in the story, but particularly for Bengali Muslims who have been scapegoated by different levels of the Indian state in its drive to expel the Bangladeshi infiltrator. But the question begs to be asked, why does Madhavan choose to focalize on a Malayali Muslim? To be sure, he is writing in Malayalam for a Malayalam readership, but I would suggest that Madhavan chooses the figure of the Malayali Muslim to stand in for Bengali Muslims because it allows him to bring out the absurdity of Hindu majoritarian claims surrounding the discourse of infiltration. Aziz is a Muslim from Kerala. He does not even speak any Bengali, but Pramila Gokhale is able to construct him as a Bangladeshi infiltrator because as an Indian Muslim, his loyalty and identification with the nation are viewed as dubious and uncertain. Moreover, his lack of papers makes his legal status as an Indian even more vulnerable and untenable. So taken together, these two stories underline the importance of official documents in embodying the individual identity of a model citizen and for exercising the everyday rights and benefits of citizenship. They also show how documents are crucial for the state's exercise of sovereignty over its territory and its population. The stories show how the lack of documents can render one a non-person in the eyes of the state. At the same time, the very documents that are meant to ensure the sovereignty of the state can paradoxically provide the means for the incorporation of clandestine migrants into their lands of arrival and settlement. This is shown very nicely in another story by Roy, which I couldn't discuss and was part of the longer paper. While documentary citizenship is a widely prevalent phenomenon in contemporary India, the courts have increasingly been called upon to determine the evidentiary value of these documents given the suspicion about their mode of acquisition. In the past few years, the courts have delivered rulings that doubt the validity of practically all forms of documentation. As Mirza Jayal succinctly asks, when the entire edifice of state documents, their verisimilitude, their integrity and their sanctity is called into question, the implications of such a complete erosion of the credibility of official documents is of enormous significance. What, if anything, can state documents testify to any longer when all of them are kind of now seen as suspect, right? What the implications of this question will be in the context of emerging national level identification systems such as the Unique Identification Project Aadhaar and the National Population Register NPR, both of which rely on biometric technology, remains to be seen. While the highly publicized Aadhaar project has repeatedly highlighted its inclusive dimension and its value to vulnerable populations, such as by providing access to public benefits, food subsidies and bank accounts, critics have drawn attention to the scaling down of its inclusive agenda in the second phase. Various kinds of documents were accepted as proof of address and identity in the first phase, including testaments from introducers, but the second phase has become stricter and requires stronger document checks. The second and parallel national level identification project, which we haven't heard that much about, is the National Population Register NPR, a database of usual residents being created through the census. The NPR suggests that each individual must provide evidence to support their citizenship status, which will then be verified by a team. An individual's citizenship will be considered suspect unless proved otherwise. So in effect, what the NPR is saying is that the burden of proof rests on the individual, and of course some of us are considered more Indian than others. The divergent goal of these two projects, Aadhaar and NPR, the one inclusive and the other exclusive, are evident on the surface. However, a closer look suggests both measures are, and I quote, mammoth surveillance projects with massive implications for tracking and tagging residents, especially given the proposed use of Aadhaar data for national security purposes. Sujata Ramachandran points out that the long-term implications of both these projects in their present formulation are very dangerous for marginal residents who possess no or limited documents. At best, such vulnerable residents will become invisible to the state, deprived of social welfare programs and all rights and benefits. At worst, constructed as illegal migrants they will live with the constant threat of eviction and may well find themselves deported. And those who are deported and expelled from the body politic may find themselves in the liminal zone of statelessness, existing in the shadows of two states but devoid of citizenship in either. Both Roy's Stateless and Madhavan's Mumbai are remarkably prescient in the ways in which they foreshadow the fate, that is, expulsion or statelessness, of marginal residents who are unable to validate their citizenship identity under national level identification programs such as Aadhaar and NPT. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
For my MPhil research, I am working with Bangladeshi immigrants in Mumbai, and a lot of them go to immense pains to acquire an Aadhaar card. They are originally from Bangladesh, they get an Aadhaar card, but they also know that the Aadhaar is not a proof of citizenship, as it is very clearly written on the Aadhaar card. And they also term it as, like, if you have an Aadhaar card, you do not have an ID. It's an Aadhaar card. But still the idea of Aadhaar and the politics behind Aadhaar becomes so important that they are willing to shell out as much as half of their monthly pay behind an Aadhaar card. Could you explain, like, could you say something more about the importance of Aadhaar? Like, why such a document which will not give them anything still becomes the lifeline to hold on to?
See, what I'm saying is, I think that first of all, Aadhaar, how it projects itself on the UIAD website is actually quite different, because it suggests that it is not an ID card, but in effect it is serving as a de facto identity card today in India. I mean, you would have, it was a scheme of the previous government, right? But Modi has embraced it completely, to the extent that, he's ordered Aadhaar cards for all by June 2015. As of now, apparently the current Aadhaar enrollment is about 68 crore. And he wants about 50 crore people to have been brought under his ambit within the next, 6 months. Whether that's going to happen or not is a different issue, and how it will happen. And a lot of critics have talked about how there's a lot of scope for impersonation because of the way in which this whole process has been outsourced to private agencies. Right? So anyone can go ask, and this biometric data is then going to be transferred through the use of memory sticks. So there's a lot of scope for corruption and impersonation over here. So what I'm saying is that I think the migrants that you're talking about, the vulnerable residents, are in fact uncannily very aware of the importance of the Aadhaar, and how in fact it is going to serve as the basis of many forms of identity and other documents. See, because the process of acquiring documents is a cumulative process, right? So once you have the Aadhaar, it will allow you to get other kinds of documents. And look at how the LPG subsidy has now been linked to the Aadhaar card. I mean, it made me so mad the other day. Now you pay 609 rupees, and if you want the 200 rupees back in your bank account, it has to, you have to link your Aadhaar with your bank account or give a cancel check. And even the PM's Jan Yojana scheme is very much linked to the Aadhaar card. And in fact, he has decided that all prisoners should be enrolled under this project, all prisoners in the country. And he wants to take forward a lot of schemes like the rural employment guarantee scheme, pensions, scholarships, public distribution system, and LPG. They have all been linked to the Aadhaar card. So in fact, the people you interviewed and talked to are in fact very smart in being aware of the importance of the Aadhaar card, because ultimately it can lead to the document that is considered most important of all, which is a passport, right? That enables you to travel legally between the boundaries of the nation state. So it is in fact being projected, especially given its complete, the way in which the government has, the Modi government has embraced it wholeheartedly after all the criticisms that were meted out against Manmohan Singh's government. Does that answer your question? Other thoughts?
The paper really illustrated the question of intersectionality quite a lot. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the issue of gender and how that works for the immigrant, because it is really interesting that Ramada portrays a woman and she can sort of lay claim to her nationality, through the aid of majoritarian politics. by claiming her, like she uses her religion or her caste to sort of, without document, prove that she is Indian. Whereas Azhar and Aziz find it so difficult without a document. But then what happens to a woman who's an immigrant who's trying to get a document, particularly because many of the documents that we have to get in India through our identity actually asks us to not only say how we are related to the state, but how we relate to the state through a man. Like whose daughter are you, or whose wife are you? So if you can talk a little bit about that.
I think that's a great question, and something that I don't really address in this paper. But you know, there are other narratives that do that, which I couldn't address, and especially in film. And I've come across at least two films. One is a Bengali film called Kantatar, and the other is an Odia film called Kathantara, and which is really interesting because it takes you to the space of Odisha, and where this woman who is basically categorized as an illegal migrant, even though her family had migrated years ago in the immediate aftermath of partition, and ultimately to stay on in India because she doesn't want to go back to Bangladesh. I mean, her ancestors, her father had migrated. She's even born in India. She has to get married to an Odia fisherman. You know, so that I think that you're right, and even the other film that I'm talking about. So gender certainly complicates the issues precisely because, as you said, that it's about how we are related to the state through a man. You know, so I mean, but there are lots of interesting case studies that people like Kamal Sadiq and Sujata Ramachandran have pointed out about this woman called Razia Begum, and a lot of cases. If you look at case law, there's a lot of material over there. But I think you're right that the film that I really love that discusses this, but she's not a Bangladeshi migrant, is Shyam Benegal's Mammo. Any of you seen this film? It's a wonderful, wonderful film about a woman who had migrated to Pakistan in the immediate aftermath of partition, not because she wanted to go, because her husband was migrating. And then she wants to come back to India and live there. She comes to visit because her surviving sister and the sister's grandson are living in Bombay. And then she wants to stay on. So she keeps trying to extend her visa by dubious means, by basically bribing the police officer, etc., etc. And ultimately it ends with her, because she has no other means, what she does is she submits a death certificate to both the Indian and Pakistani to authorities in order to be able to live on in India with her sister and the grandson. And any of you who knows Khalid Muhammad, the filmmaker and the journalist, he's better known as a Hindi film critic, but he's the one who made films like Fiza. He wrote the script of Mammo, Sardari Begum, and the other one, Zubeda. So Mammo is based on the story of his granddad, usually based on the story of his granddad. So I'm just saying that would be a really interesting sort of film to look at, to think about these questions of gender and how that sort of intersects with other identities and complicates. No, and what I'm suggesting in my reading is that it is precisely because he is Muslim, and even though he doesn't speak Bengali, that is what leads Pramila Gokhale to sort of construct him as a petty functionary of the state, to sort of categorize him as an illegal migrant, and he's faced with the imminent threat of deportation. So in that story, I think religion becomes key. His religious identity as a minority religious subject is what Aziz is trying to draw attention to in the 1990s.
In that situation, like with the officer, when every aspect of his identity is suspect, somehow that he is Muslim is preassumed.
Yes.
So, but that does not somehow come into the conversation. It's never questioned. No documentation is asked for that.
Yeah, because like you said, it's assumed his name, right? It's his name that is supposed to be the giveaway, which leads her to question his identity and his credentials as an Indian.
And yet his language is not sufficient.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's what. In fact, like I said, why does he choose a Malayali Muslim? If it were a Bengali Muslim, it would be far more within the realist framework of the story. But he's trying to bring out the absurdity of some of Hindu nationalist, Hindu majoritarian claims in the ways in which they scapegoated Bengali Muslims in particular. And I want to give you another example. I have a woman, who basically works in my house in Delhi. And she lives in a kind of a slum area near where we live, and she is from a village in West Bengal, but she was talking about these deportation drives that took place somewhere around 2004 and all, and she says how the police and the authorities came over there, and at that point they didn't discriminate between Hindu and Muslim also. It was seen as a Bengali area where people lived together of a certain class background. See, class is also very, very important, something that we haven't really addressed. And literally, so many of them ran away overnight to their villages because they were scared that they were going to be just forcibly deported across the border. And she is someone who's clearly from a Hindu working class background. So, you know, so at some point everyone becomes a kind of, in the stories that we've talked about, the Muslim identity plays a very strong role. But it's not, even the Odia movie that I talked about, Kathantara, in that she's a Bengali Hindu girl. You know, so and it's very interesting how her family is also being targeted as East Bengali because of their origins and because of their belated arrival into the nation space of India. Right?
Assam, we were talking about illegal Bangladeshi Muslim, Bangladeshi immigrants and all that. And even among the Muslim, like they, like to distinguish themselves. For example, like I have few friends, and they were like upper caste. I don't know how to use caste within Islam. I have no idea about it. But they're like, we are upper caste Muslims, and we are Pathans. We are not Bangladeshi Muslims, and they like to stress on that point. And we are not Bangladeshi Muslims, which is like immediately seen as something low, dirty, and they're Pathans. We are not them. We are upper caste, and they use that kind of word. So even within Muslims, that demarcation they have, they like to make that distinction. We are not them. We are superior.
And I mean, any group is not homogeneous, right? I mean, certainly Bengali Muslims as a group are not a monolith, as we all know. So, and clearly the people you are talking about are in fact afraid precisely of being identified and equated with those who must be evicted. That is the foreigner.
Assamese Muslims.
Yes.
They are high caste
Assamese. And they need to affirm their identity as such.
Those are Bangladeshi illegal Muslims.
Yes.
Who are like,
Yes, so they feel the need to differentiate and demarcate themselves from the illegal other, precisely because they don't want to face the threat of eviction, etc. Right?
Even the physicality, they focus on the physicality that we are tall, we are fair, we have long noses.
Yeah.
That beauty of the Pathan, Kashmiri Pathan, Afghani Pathan, they stress on that, and they're like short, stubby.
And what happens if you have someone who actually blurs these categories? So I mean, that's what I'm saying. Those are all like external markers that are always suspect to be interrogated. Right? So, other questions or thoughts? Yeah. Can you just stand up if you don't mind? It's hard for me to hear.
We talked about the difference between foreigners, strangers, and friends. And I think I would call it
Sorry.
what is exactly the difference? Where you would draw a line between who's a foreigner and who's a stranger?
Yeah. So I guess I got myself into trouble with that comment. Actually I've written a paper about this, which is an examination of two very different books. Savarkar's Who's Hindutva, Who's a Hindu, and Nehru's Discovery of India. And I offer a kind of Derridian reading of these two texts. And see, part of what I'm doing, the word foreigner and stranger is used a lot in Derrida's work on hospitality, and that's sort of what I'm responding to over here. And but Derrida writes in French, and in French, for those of you who know any French, you know what's the French word for stranger? Étranger. What's the French word for foreigner? That's exactly it. So in French, you have one word for both these concepts, right? In English, we have two. And of course, we know a stranger, a foreigner, in modernity at least, is someone who comes from another nation state, defined in terms of passports and visas and borders. But a stranger, in English, how would you talk about someone who's a stranger? Say that? Yeah, the unknown person, the unfamiliar person, right? Someone who is a newcomer and has settled amidst us, right? But somehow remains suspect precisely because of his belated arrival into the nation space, right? This is a person who's come, who's settled, who's decided to stay on over here with us. So not a foreigner in that sense, but is still seen as a kind of unknown, unfamiliar kind of suspect person, because the moment of his arrival can actually be pinpointed, and it is after the arrival of the so-called organic national subjects, right? So what I'm trying to suggest, and what I was suggesting in that, and even in Greek you have one word, xenos, to cover both stranger and foreigner. And when Derrida writes in French, he uses the term étranger, and the meaning sort of slips between stranger and foreigner when you, as they're used in English. So his translators often explain their use of either stranger or foreigner, or both, depending on the context. So they're always at pains to figure out which word to use in the English translation. So what I was trying to suggest in my reading was that the word stranger, that in fact these are very closely overlapping concepts, but we will only be able to see the overlaps between the concepts of the stranger and the foreigner once we differentiate between the two, which the English language allows us to do in the way that I just did. But once we differentiate, we should then be able to see the overlap, and the overlap has to do with the fact that both of them are in effect identified with an outside space, an outside culture, or an outside religion. And so what I was trying to say is that minority religious subjects, in this particular instance the Indian Muslim, is often constructed as a stranger, but in times of crisis, the overlap between the stranger and the foreigner becomes more and more clear, and ultimately as the enemy, right, who must be expelled from the body politic. So, and in modernity, the overlaps between these concepts become more and more evident, and typically the term stranger is used to talk about migrant populations, right? But it's also used to talk about, when you talk about Indian Muslims, even Savarkar, writing in the early part of the 20s, was very aware that Indian Muslims are not exactly, they're not a migrant population, right? And he's also very familiar with the Aryan migration theory. Because if you call Muslims migrants, which anyway is deeply problematic, and anyone will question that, except for more recent politicians, then you should be talking about the Vedic Aryans also as migrants, right? And that itself is open to a lot of interpretation and debate. But then everyone is a migrant. But the key difference, according to Savarkar, is that Vedic religion was revealed within the nation space of India, whereas Indian Muslims and Indian Christians follow a religion that was revealed outside the nation space of India, and therefore they need to convert in effect. That's what Savarkar sort of ends his book with. But what I was suggesting in my reading of Nehru and Savarkar together is that both end up constructing upper caste Hindus as the organic or core nationals in the way that Pramila Gokhale does in this story. My name is my identity, Maharashtrian, Chitpavan, Brahmin. I don't need to explain my Indianness. You can take it for granted.
So that brings us to the end of this opening session of the English stream program. So thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for conducting such an engaging session despite the fact that you were quite unwell. It was very interesting to talk about the difference between citizenship and belonging, and how the category of citizenship and legality is quite so unstable. And thank you for being here on a Sunday morning. We hope to see you all at the paper presentation that will follow right after. I'm sure they'll all add greatly to the discourse to which ma'am has set the tone. Thank you. We will now have, as a token of gratitude, we will now have our Department Secretary Yashaswini presenting a memorandum.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for having me, and thank you, like Shilpa said, for being here on a Sunday morning. It is quite the, I understand what a big effort it is.